There was a time when I truly believed that being busy meant being alive. Productivity felt like proof that my life was moving in the right direction, and exhaustion seemed like an acceptable price for progress. My mornings began before the sun had fully risen, often accompanied by the sharp sound of an alarm that pulled me abruptly from shallow sleep. I would rush through familiar routines, barely noticing the quiet world outside my window, and my nights usually ended long after the streets around my apartment had fallen into silence. Each day followed an almost identical rhythm: alarms, emails, meetings, deadlines, and conversations that felt urgent in the moment but faded quickly from memory once the day was over. Life moved quickly, efficiently, and without pause. From the outside, everything appeared to be working exactly as it should. I had a job that paid well enough to provide comfort and security. I carried responsibilities that earned respect from others, and my structured routines created the impression of stability and success. Friends and colleagues often described my life as dependable, even admirable. Yet beneath all that constant motion, something inside me had quietly stopped moving. While my schedule remained full, my inner world felt strangely empty, as though a vital part of me had withdrawn without announcing its departure. I remember one particular morning with unusual clarity. Nothing extraordinary happened that day. There was no crisis, no conflict, no dramatic turning point. It was simply an ordinary Tuesday that looked indistinguishable from hundreds of others before it. I was standing on a crowded train during the morning commute, surrounded by strangers who stared silently at glowing screens held inches from their faces. The windows reflected rows of tired expressions, softened by the dim light as the train rushed through tunnels toward another predictable beginning. And then, without warning, a quiet thought surfaced. It wasn't emotional or overwhelming. It arrived gently, almost calmly, yet with undeniable clarity. Is this really my life? The question startled me because I had never allowed myself to ask it before. For as long as I could remember, life had been defined by forward movement: study harder, work harder, achieve more, keep going, no matter how tired you felt. Stopping seemed dangerous, and questioning the path felt irresponsible, almost ungrateful. So for years, I avoided reflection and focused only on momentum. But that morning, something shifted. I began noticing details I had ignored countless times before. I saw how exhausted everyone looked, how mechanical our movements had become, how people existed beside one another without truly being present, including me. A sudden realization settled heavily in my mind. I could not remember the last time I had felt genuinely excited to wake up in the morning, not satisfied after completing tasks, not relieved when work ended, not distracted by entertainment, but truly excited about living another day. That realization followed me everywhere like a quiet shadow. At work, conversations blended together into indistinct noise, while numbers filled my screen. Colleagues laughed about weekend plans, promotions, investments, and long-term ambitions. I smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, participating just enough to appear engaged. Yet internally, I felt detached, as though I were observing someone else perform the role of my life while I watched from a distance. When evening arrived, I returned home and sat in silence longer than usual. I didn't turn on the television or reach for my phone. There was no music to fill the room, no distraction to soften the stillness. For the first time in years, I allowed quiet to exist around me. And within that quiet, something uncomfortable began rising to the surface, a feeling I had spent years avoiding through constant activity. I realized that I was not unhappy in the traditional sense. Nothing was visibly broken. My life functioned smoothly, predictably, efficiently. But I was not truly living either. I was functioning, existing, maintaining momentum without meaning. Day after day, I fulfilled expectations while slowly losing connection with myself. And somehow, without noticing when or how it happened, I had drifted so far from my inner world that I no longer recognized the person I had become. I had mastered the art of living responsibly, yet along the way, I had quietly become a stranger to my own life. In the weeks that followed, memories began returning to me in ways I neither expected nor controlled. They did not arrive during dramatic moments or periods of deep reflection, but quietly, almost gently, during ordinary routines. While washing dishes late at night, walking home beneath fading streetlights, or standing patiently as coffee brewed in the early morning, fragments of my past surfaced without invitation. These memories felt vivid and alive, as though a forgotten version of myself had begun knocking softly at the door of my awareness. Slowly, I started remembering who I used to be before life became defined by responsibility and caution. When I was younger, the world felt vast and open, filled with possibilities that seemed endless. I imagined traveling to unfamiliar places, creating work that carried meaning beyond financial reward, and meeting people whose stories would challenge and transform my understanding of life. Back then, success meant freedom, the ability to explore, to grow, and to live according to curiosity rather than expectation. Somewhere along the journey into adulthood, however, that definition changed so gradually that I barely noticed it happening. Success stopped meaning freedom and quietly became something else entirely. It became security, approval from others, and the comfort of predictability. Without realizing it, I began choosing what felt safe instead of what felt alive at first. These compromises appeared insignificant. I accepted a job that offered stability, even though it failed to inspire me. I postponed personal dreams, convincing myself that there would always be time later. I ignored moments of curiosity because responsibility seemed more urgent and practical. Each decision felt reasonable on its own, and life continued smoothly. Years passed gently, almost kindly, without crisis or collapse. Nothing fell apart, and no external force demanded change. Yet that absence of disruption became the very thing that kept me stuck. Comfort, I realized, has a quiet power. It can slowly silence the inner voice that reminds you who you are meant to become. One night, unable to sleep and restless with thoughts I could no longer ignore, I reached beneath my bed and pulled out an old box I had not opened in years. Inside were photographs faded by time, notebooks filled with unfinished ideas, and letters from friends whose lives had gradually moved in different directions. Among them lay a journal I had not touched in nearly a decade. Opening it felt strangely intimate, as though I were meeting a younger stranger who once knew me deeply. The handwriting inside was energetic and confident, filled with hope and fearlessness that felt distant from the person I had become. One sentence stopped me completely. I want a life that feels meaningful, even if it's uncertain. I stared at those words for a long time, feeling both recognition and sadness. When had certainty become more valuable to me than meaning? When had fear quietly begun guiding my decisions, while disguising itself as maturity and responsibility? In that moment, a painful realization settled in. The life I was living was not wrong or unsuccessful. It simply belonged to a version of myself that no longer existed. Continuing along the same path required ignoring the person I had slowly grown into. This understanding did not bring relief as I had hoped. Instead, it brought grief, a quiet mourning for lost possibilities and abandoned dreams. I began to understand that change rarely begins with excitement or inspiration. More often, it begins with loss. The loss of identity, the loss of familiarity, and the loss of a future you once believed was permanent. For the first time, I recognized that the greatest distance a person can experience is not measured between cities or countries, but between who they truly are and the role they continue pretending to live. Deciding to change did not happen overnight, nor did it arrive as a sudden moment of bravery or a dramatic turning point that transformed everything at once. There was no announcement, no inspiring speech to myself, and no overwhelming surge of confidence. Instead, change began quietly, almost invisibly, through small and deeply personal acts of honesty. I started paying closer attention to my daily experiences, noticing what left me feeling exhausted and what unexpectedly restored my energy. I observed conversations more carefully, recognizing which ones felt sincere and meaningful and which seemed rehearsed. Polite performances meant only to maintain appearances. Gradually, I chose to spend more time alone, something that initially felt uncomfortable and unfamiliar without constant distractions. Silence allowed my thoughts to grow louder. Doubts quickly surfaced, asking questions I had long avoided. I wondered whether I was being ungrateful for the stability I already had, whether walking away might destroy everything I had worked so hard to build, and whether starting again would ultimately prove that I had failed. Fear argued persuasively because it sounded reasonable and practical, reminding me of risks and uncertainties. Yet beneath that fear, another voice slowly emerged, calmer, quieter, but far more honest. It asked a simple question that lingered in my mind. If nothing changed, how would I feel 5 years from now? The answer unsettled me more deeply than uncertainty ever could, because I realized I would likely remain trapped in the same quiet dissatisfaction. So I began letting go, not dramatically, but gradually. I declined commitments that no longer felt authentic and reduced the time I spent seeking approval from others. I returned to interests I had abandoned years earlier, rediscovering small joys that once felt essential to who I was. Some people struggled to understand these changes, while others naturally drifted away, teaching me that personal growth often reshapes relationships before it alters external circumstances. Eventually, the moment I both anticipated and feared arrived. I resigned from my job. There was no applause or celebration, only a signed document followed by an unexpected sense of peaceful silence. Walking out of the building on my final day, I felt both lighter and deeply afraid, because freedom removes excuses and demands responsibility. For the first time in years, my future felt unwritten. Life slowed down. I walked without rushing, read without watching the clock, and listened fully when others spoke. Gradually, something remarkable happened. I began noticing life again. Sunlight filtering through windows, laughter shared between strangers, and the simple relief of breathing without urgency returned to my awareness. I realized I was not rebuilding success as I once understood it. I was rebuilding awareness. And slowly, piece by piece, I began meeting myself again, rediscovering a sense of presence that had been missing for far too long. Transformation rarely looks dramatic from the inside. From a distance, change is often imagined as a powerful turning point marked by certainty and visible progress. But in reality, most of my days felt surprisingly ordinary. There were no constant breakthroughs or moments of triumph. Instead, life unfolded quietly, filled with uncertainty, occasional loneliness, financial concerns, and lingering doubt about whether I had made the right decision. Starting over gradually stripped away the identities that had once defined me. Without professional titles, structured schedules, or familiar routines to lean on, I was left facing a difficult and deeply personal question. Who am I without achievement? The answer did not arrive quickly. It revealed itself slowly through experience rather than reflection alone. I began learning new skills, exploring unfamiliar paths, and allowing myself to try things without knowing whether they would succeed. I failed often, sometimes in small ways, and sometimes in ways that deeply challenged my confidence. Yet failure no longer felt like evidence that I was inadequate. Instead, it began to feel like movement, proof that I was participating fully in life, rather than standing safely on the sidelines. Each attempt, successful or not, carried me forward in ways comfort never had along the way. I met people whose lives were not guided by status or comparison, but by curiosity and genuine interest in growth. Conversations with them felt different, slower, deeper, and more meaningful. Time itself seemed fuller, no longer divided strictly between productivity and rest. Through these experiences, I gradually discovered that meaning is rarely found in constant success. Instead, it emerges from alignment, from living in a way that reflects personal values rather than external expectations. Months quietly turned into years, and one evening, while walking home beneath a calm and open sky, I noticed something subtle yet profoundly important. I was no longer rushing toward some imagined future where happiness would finally begin. I was present within my life as it existed in that moment. A sense of peace had replaced the urgency that once governed my decisions. Life had not become perfect or free of difficulty, but it had become honest. And honesty brought a deeper form of stability than certainty ever could. Looking back now, I understand that my life did not change because of one bold decision. It changed gradually. Each time I chose authenticity over fear. Each time I listened to my inner voice instead of external pressure. And each time I allowed uncertainty to exist without immediately trying to escape it. Starting again did not erase my past. Instead, it integrated it into a more complete understanding of myself. The person I used to be was never a mistake, only an earlier beginning that led me here. Perhaps that is what growth truly means, not becoming someone entirely new, but returning gently and courageously to the person you were always meant to be. Now, when mornings arrive, I no longer measure my days by productivity or achievement alone. I measure them by presence, by connection, and by whether I feel awake to my own existence. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I remember that crowded train from years ago, when a simple question first disrupted the rhythm of my life. Is this really my life? Today, I know the answer with calm certainty. Yes, it is. And for the first time, I am no longer running from it.